Chair, and congratulations to the member for Warrington South for this debate and for his 10-minute rule bill and bringing trade union issues into the House of Commons. And it is only the Labour side, with some exceptions, that press these issues continuously and bring worker voice into this space. I really do welcome the opportunity to speak on what is an important issue for workers everywhere. We know from information provided by a number of unions, and I'll declare my interest as a member of Unite the Union, but the Bakers Union, GMB, Unite and Unison have said that union officials are just routinely denied access to workers by many employers. We have examples of trade unions locked out of workplaces, prevented from speaking to workers and forced to meet in car parks, and some horrifying stories that have been outlined by comrades in this room today. In reality, what is this debate really about? In my mind, it's simply about trade unions and workers exercising a fundamental right to meet and to discuss and organise on issues which face workers, a right which is systematically being denied in this country, because for most workers, the right doesn't actually exist, and it's not existed for some time because of the serious restrictions placed upon unions, because of anti-union practices by employers, and crucially the fear that is whipped up in workplaces, often preventing workers from having the confidence to exercise those rights. And here are just a few of the examples taking place across the UK when workers take part in union activity or want to meet with their trade unions or talk to fellow workers. It was mentioned before that a young worker from Watford was enthused by winning positive change in his workplace through the union, but he was then banned from going into any McDonald's in the area and told he wasn't allowed to talk to other workers, wasn't actually allowed to talk to other workers. We're told that managers are trained to notice the signs and language of a union and told to report it to senior management if they see it. Managers telling workers that they can be sacked for joining a trade union. Portuguese workers in McDonald's in Cambridge told they could be sent to jail for taking strike action. Tim Martin, the chair and founder of Wetherspoons, refusing to even speak to the General Secretary of the Bakers Union when the Bakers Union have many members in Wetherspoons. I mean, what kind of disregard is that? The General Secretary of PCS having to address his civil servant members in January in a blizzard in a car park. What kind of respect is that to all of his members and him as a General Secretary? We know that union organisers are routinely banned from workplaces. The law needs to be changed if we want to open up workplaces so that workers are able to actually realise their right. The Labour Party have been clear that in order to dramatically improve the rates of pay and therefore wages and terms and conditions of workers, we need a system of collective bargaining restored. If the balance of power in the workplace is to be redressed, workers need to be able to negotiate. That's, it's a fundamental principle. And in For the Many, Not the Few, I'm sure every member on that side read the Labour Party's manifesto in 2017, but it was the manifesto that many of us on this side were elected on, promised that a Labour government would roll out sectoral collective bargaining and will guarantee trade unions a right of access to the workplace so that unions can speak to members and, crucially, potential members. The Grand Chamber of the European Court of Human Rights established 11 years ago that the right to bargain collectively is a fundamental human right protected by the Convention. Yet the latest statistics show that coverage of collective bargaining in the UK has fallen to 26% of workers. We know that it's even lower than that in the private sector, down from 82% 40 years ago in 1979. And of course it's been a series and a direction of it. It's been political ideology that has forced that percentage downwards. Yet the ILO, the OECD and even the IMF has shown that extensive collective bargaining is essential to a successful economy, as has so eloquently been outlined by colleagues today, and crucially the reduction of inequality. So trade union access to members and workers is essential for the restoration of collective bargaining. With this in mind, it has been mentioned, but I'll say it again, many trade unionists have looked on with envy at legislation in New Zealand, where union representatives have a right to access workplaces to do the following. And, you might want to take note of some of these very simple asks, but discuss union business with its members, recruit new union members, provide information to any employee on the premises, because if you're not a member of the trade union, do we agree with the fundamental right that you should have access to information that allows you to consider union membership, to bargain with the employer for a collective agreement, deal with health and safety issues for its members, check that the employer is complying with collective agreements, check that the employer is complying with employment law, help individuals implement individual employment agreements, and ask the employer to comply with any relevant requirements if non-compliance has been detected. So many crucial things to help workers access their basic rights. And yet there is no comparable right of access in this country. It is true that there's a Bayes Code of Practice that gives us union access to the workplace during recognition ballots. But Labour will build on this to provide a general right of access for trade union officials for the lawful purposes of trade unions to access the workplace. Under Labour's plans, trade unions will have right of access to a workplace on given reasonable notice to the employer for the purposes of organising, meeting and representing workers on any matter relating to their employment. The employer shall be under a duty to provide an opportunity for meetings to be held on the premises in conditions which are reasonable and appropriate and, crucially, which respect confidentiality of the workers and the union. And I would like to access two points here. The first is that access must mean both physical access and access by email, where the email is provided and controlled by the employer. In both cases, access should be free from employer surveillance. Workers should not be prevented from speaking to a union for fear of intimidation. The second point is that we have to deal with employers who refuse to provide access, despite the law. Access delayed, is access denied, as the saying goes. And here we may need to look to New Zealand again, where denial of access can lead to financial penalties on the employer. We'll look at all of the different ways to ensure that denial of trade union rights on access, as well as other trade union rights, is dealt with effectively and appropriately by enforcement. Any effective right of access introduced by a Labour government along these lines will go a long way to help restore the balance of power in the workplace. It will enable trade unions to speak to workers, as I've said, about the benefits of trade unionism, trade union mechanism, and expand the coverage of collective bargaining. And it will enable trade unions to speak for workers, to ensure that workers are effectively represented to address some of the abuses which we know are taking place. Colleagues talked about workers being scared to go to the toilet or having to go to the toilet in really degrading circumstances, heavily pregnant women, not being given a seat. It's clearly men who've never been heavily pregnant designing these rules. And the government just refuses to address, through legislation, through serious legislation, some of these abuses. Just leave it to the free market, leave it to the employers to do whatever they want to do. But having said that, I'm very mindful that access and rights of access can only be the very beginning of a programme to restore trade union presence in the workplace. It's only the start of giving workers a voice and ensuring that they have high standards and good quality of work, and that is a reality for everyone. In addition to access, we need to look again at the trade union recognition legislation to remove obstacles that make it difficult for trade unions to secure recognition for collective bargaining. We need to look again at the legislation for dealing with trade union facilities so that trade union representatives in the workplace have the time, they have the space, they have the resources and powers to carry out their duties, and the legislation dealing with the right of workers to be accompanied by a trade union to ensure that all workers have the right to full trade union representation at work. We're under no illusions that trade union access in the workplace or to the workplace is one of several crucial steps in strengthening workers' rights. It's an essential step in our plans to roll out sectoral collective bargaining. And with the reintroduction of sectoral collective bargaining, so by sector, workers are able to negotiate and determine pay and terms and conditions. We will, of course, it will be hinged on workplaces being opened up. And I think this is critical. I'm going to kind of finish on a political point, because this is a political chamber, isn't it? But and so often is void, when we're looking at the technical details of all of this. But what does it actually mean for workers? Well, I think throughout our history, has there not been a constant tension between workers and the state, with the state often removing the rights that workers have fought for or ignoring and resisting the rights that workers demand? Trade union access to the workplace goes to the very heart of how our society is set up and the cultural norms that are established and who they benefit. The cultural norms that very often aren't established by working class people themselves. The current climate demands that workers be scared to talk about the issues that affect them at work. Our current culture is one that makes them petrified of losing their job, that this should be their number one fear and should dictate how they act and what they say in the workplace. The current system and the norms that we live by support this climate of fear, so that the worker is in deference to the employer all of the time, worried at any time that they could be replaced. It's a system rigged against workers to enable those who own capital or business that was mentioned before to extract as much value as possible out of the worker for the smallest reward and in the least comfort, it seems. And the consequences of all of this is that power is concentrated in so few hands, and it is really, really unhealthy. It means that we have entire workforces who are stressed, tired, underpaid, undervalued, and, let's be honest, deeply dissatisfied with life and have little to look forward to. And in the labour and trade union movement, we just have a totally different way of viewing the world of work. We believe that it's workers who create the wealth, that they deserve the right to negotiate freely the rate that they are paid, that it is a fundamental right of workers to assemble, to associate with one another, to organise, to bargain with the employer as one voice. It is therefore common sense that trade unions should have access to the workplace. It is their space. It's theirs, and their right to meet with people that they represent or wish to represent. It shouldn't be a difficult concept to grasp. And I think if policies were won on the strength of argument alone, then this side would clearly have won this argument, not because nobody else from the other side has spoken. Our argument isn't that weak. Our argument is a powerful and common sense one. Even though they didn't turn up. To my mind, those on the other side of this argument very much do grasp the simplicity of enacting this right. But I think they are deeply scared and worried of its transformative potential for working class people. Thank you.